Today, is the worm turning? The DFA Daily to the 12th of April 2021. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to this post covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. Today we look at the latest information about first home buyers and housing affordability, and also review in more detail the Reserve Bank's Financial Stability Report, as well as look at some other important information. But we start with the Australian broker, who reported that first home buyer numbers have continued to fall, according to recent numbers released by the ABS. First home buyers were 3.3% less of the market in February 2021 than they had been in January, though that still was over 16,000 loans written to those making their first step into the property ladder. We were expecting it this year anyway, said Andrew Wilson, the chief economist at Archistar. The worst news for first home buyers is higher prices, and we're certainly getting that now. First home buyer numbers are still very high. In fact, the February number was the second highest since 2009, which is the strongest period we've ever had for first home buyers. The numbers are still extraordinarily high in that sense, but they are coming off. I would expect that to continue over the year as house prices continue to rise, and certainly house prices are going to rise in Sydney and Melbourne, as well as other capital cities. It's bad news for first home buyers, but for the broader owner-occupied markets, it swings and roundabouts because you also get a bigger trade-in value in the sale as your home value rises. First home buyers don't have the luxury of a trade-in, so they're really restricted by higher prices to either a cut in interest rates or higher incomes. We know that income growth is very low at the moment, and there's no prospect of a cut in interest rates, which are about as close to zero as they're going to get. So we'll see few first home buyers in the market. It isn't just the market, however. First home buyers have been aided by direct intervention to get them into the property ladder. The other part of the equation, which has been a positive force for first home buyers, is government stimulus packages, says Wilson. We're seeing the end of that in terms of home builder and first home buyer deposit scheme extensions. They're now finished. Also, with higher prices, it means that the thresholds for stamp duty reductions and exemptions for first home buyers will be harder to meet as prices are higher, and there are cut-offs in a number of states. It's all negative news now going forward, but we have seen a strong period of first home buyer growth, not just over the past 6 months, but also prior to that. That's because price growth has been quite benign all through 2018, 19 and 2020. That was good news for first home buyers, as they're able to get into the market with their savings, as they didn't have to play catch up as when they were doing so this year. We're also starting to see more investors in the market from a low base, but investors typically crowd out first home buyers, and that will be another factor that will reduce the first home buyer numbers. Certainly, though, they're still very strong, and it'll be an easing of activity rather than a sharp fall, he said. But more broadly, housing affordability is a problem. Here's why super for housing isn't a solution, says Brendan Coates from the Grattan Institute in the conversation. The idea that young Australians should be able to dip into their super to help buy their first home keeps going round and round. The most recent iteration, put forward by the Coalition's Tim Wilson and a clutch of other backbenchers, has the catchy slogan, "Home first, super second." Wilson and Co are right in their diagnosis. Australia has a housing affordability problem, but they're wrong in their prescription. Their proposal would actually make housing less affordable. There are several much better ways to revive the great Australian dream for young Australians. Home ownership rates are falling fast, especially among the young and poor. In Australia today, fewer than half of 25 to 34-year-olds own their own home. Home ownership amongst the poorest fifth of that age group has fallen from 63% in 1981 to 23% today. Today's younger Australians are tomorrow's retirees. This trend suggests that by 2056, just 2/3 of retirees will own their home, down from nearly 80% today. The government's retirement income review showed most homeowners on track for a comfortable retirement, but Australians who rent are facing an increasingly bleak future. Senior Australians who rent in the private market are much more likely to suffer financial stress than homeowners or renters in public housing. Nearly 1/2 of all retired renters are in poverty, with incomes below half the median when housing costs are taken into account. Their number will only grow as fewer retirees in future own their homes. Saving for a deposit is the biggest hurdle to home ownership. In the early 1990s, it took 6 years to save a 20% deposit on an average home. Today, it takes 10 years. That's why the Home First Super Second campaign is superficially attractive. It seems obvious that compulsory superannuation, forcing workers to save almost 10% of their wages for retirement, stops many from buying a home, especially poorer, younger Australians without access to the bank of mum and dad. And it's true that allowing people to dip into their super to buy a home would certainly not leave Australians impoverished in retirement. Grattan Institute research finds that most Australians would have a comfortable retirement even if they withdrew $20,000 early, because whatever they lost in super would largely be made up by a greater entitlement to the age pension. But the problem for the Home First Super Second campaign is that allowing Australians to use their super to buy a home would do little, if anything, to increase home ownership rates. The younger, poorer Australians who are increasingly being priced out of home ownership don't have much in the way of superannuation. The poorest 20% of households, headed by a 35 to 44-year-old, precisely the group for whom home ownership is falling fast, typically have no superannuation. The next poorest 20% typically have only $15,000 in super. It means allowing Australians to use their super for housing would mainly help wealthier people buy more expensive homes. And there's another problem. The more people you allow to use money from their super to buy a home, the more demand there is for housing. Higher demand means higher prices, meaning the biggest winners will be the people who own homes already. And Grattan went on to say, if Tim Wilson and the Morrison government really want to make housing affordable, they need to get more houses built. Recent Grattan Institute research finds that relaxing planning rules to allow more homes to be built nearer the centre of Australia's major cities would help. The federal government has no direct control over planning rules, but it can provide incentives for state and local governments to relax planning rules similar to those put forward by President Joe Biden in the United States. As hard as it is increasing the supply of housing rather than pumping money from super into an already housing market is the smartest way to make housing more affordable. Maybe Tim Wilson should start a campaign, he said. Yes, but I would add, there is an oversupply of property currently being built. The problem is price, and just putting more supply when there's already too much supply is not going to solve the price conundrum. So we have to find an alternative path. I agree super is not the way to go, but just building more stuff, yet more stuff, is also not a solution either. Now, also from MPA was this warning: house price correction could be bad news for banks, says the RBA. Lenders could be in trouble if any blowout in debt corresponds with a correction in skyrocketing prices for assets like property, the Reserve Bank of Australia has warned. In its biennial financial stability review published last Friday, the RBA warned that the growth in asset prices, including property and equity, could lead to overexuberance, risky behaviour from borrowers or lenders, and higher debt. In this situation, lending standards could weaken, with asset prices being pushed above their fundamental values. The report said a correction in asset prices, if borrowers' income were to fall and so they defaulted on debt repayments, would expose lenders to large losses on the increased debt, particularly if the quality of that debt has been eroded. Risks were high in assets like housing, where prices and debt have seen a notable uptick in recent months, the Australian reported. Dwelling prices rose 2.6% in March, the strongest spike in more than 3 decades. Prices now sit at record levels in some states. However, regulators have no mandate to specifically target property prices. Regulatory authorities have said repeatedly that they would only step in to cool the market if banks started to loosen their credit standards. Still, the report said the RBA and other regulators were keeping a weather eye on the booming market. The central bank said that it was especially important for the financial sector to eschew excessive risk-taking in an environment where asset prices were skyrocketing and the cash rate remained at a record low. Increased risk-taking by lenders could take the form of looser lending standards for individual loan assessments or a relaxation of internal limits on the share of riskier loans they make, the report said. Even if lenders do not weaken their own settings, increased risk-taking by optimistic borrowers could see a deterioration in the average quality of new lending. This would weaken the resilience of businesses and households, and so the financial system, to future shocks. Increased risk-taking would fuel rising debt from already high levels, increasing the debt-related risks to the economy and financial system from a fall in asset prices and borrowers' income. And the report also noted that the vast majority of households and businesses that deferred interest payments during the COVID-19 crisis have now resumed full repayments. Recently released data revealed that the value of deferred loans, which peaked in 2020 at $270 billion, has fallen to just $14 billion, about 0.5% of total loans. Again, the Australian reported. However, the RBA warned that households and business financial stress was likely to increase as COVID-19 support measures expired. Households and businesses that derive their incomes from sectors most heavily affected by the pandemic face an elevated risk of repayment difficulties if their buffers prove to be insufficient, the central bank said. To which I reply, it's interesting that Reserve Bank doesn't think that there's a bubble in property prices at the moment, despite the fact that relative to long-term metrics, we are 40% over where they should be. I think the bank starts from a false premise, but I do agree that there are significant risks building. And elsewhere, lenders have been warned against overt risk-taking. As reported in Mortgage Business, the RBA has cautioned lenders in the financial sector against excessive risk-taking amid rising asset prices, including looser lending standards for loans. In its Financial Stability Review for April 2021, the RBA noted that accommodative financial conditions, including the commitment from central banks to keep interest rates at significantly lower levels for several years, as well as expectations of continued recovery in economic activity, have contributed to rising asset prices, including rising house prices and indebtedness in some sectors. As such, the RBA warned that in this environment of accommodative financial conditions and rising asset prices, it's particularly important that the financial sector does not engage in excessive risk-taking. Increased risk-taking would fuel rising debt from already high levels, increasing the debt-related risks in the economy and financial system from a fall in asset prices and borrowers' income. Nevertheless, the RBA underscored that lending standards have remained robust, adding that the strengthening of lending standards since the mid-2010s have ensured that indebted households generally have enough income and equity buffers to manage the COVID-19-induced economic downturn. The improvement in lending standards in Australia for property from the mid-2010s helped to ensure borrowers were well placed to weather the economic shock over the past year, demonstrating the benefits to the financial system and the economy of appropriately controlled risk, the RBA said. And the RBA noted that while lending standards were initially tightened further at the onset of COVID-19, amid fears of deteriorating economic conditions, these have since been wound back as the economic outlook improved. And the RBA also said it was optimistic about the levels of housing loan arrears rates, adding that any rise in arrears over the coming months would likely be more modest than previously expected due to better than expected economic conditions. According to the RBA, loans still on deferrals are at a greater risk of entering arrears than those that have already exited repayment deferral arrangements. The share of high loan-to-value ratio loans increased over the second half of 2020, but has remained low by historical standards, the RBA said, while the share of interest-only lending has remained steady at low levels, and the share of lending at high debt-to-income ratios also increased over the second half of 2020 following earlier declines. The RBA attributed some of the increases in high LVR lending to owner-occupiers in the greater share of first home buyers, who it said had responded to government incentives such as the Home Builder Scheme and the First Home Loan Deposit Scheme, and lower interest rates, increasing the appeal of purchasing a home compared to renting. The RBA's analysis of securitization system data showed that loans less than 5 years old, first home buyers and other loans had similar prepayment buffers and arrears rates. While new loans are generally at higher risk of facing repayment difficulties in the event of a shock to household income than older loans, there is little evidence to suggest that lending to first home buyers has been an especially risky form of lending, the RBA said. And meanwhile, the RBA said in its review that non-banks had grown housing lending since late 2020 after limiting at the peak of the COVID-19 crisis. The non-banks have increased issuance of residential mortgage-backed securities to high levels since funding conditions have improved, while spreads have declined to their lowest levels since 2007, the central bank said. Liaison indicates that credit quality at non-bank lenders has remained sound, both for lending to households and to businesses, it said. One indication of the resilience of the sector has been its ability to manage loan repayment deferrals. Both the share of prime customers on deferral at non-banks and the credit quality of their deferred loans during and after the deferral period appears to be similar to those at the banks. And elsewhere, MPA has reported that one major bank has said to offer commissions to real estate agents. Much has been said recently about the differential in turnaround times between the broker and proprietary channels, but according to Shaw Financial CEO Theo Chambers, there is one major bank in particular that is going head-to-head with brokers. Not only are they deliberately delaying applications via the broker channel, but they've hired lenders and targeting the same referral channels brokers use to get their business, such as accountants, solicitors and real estate agents, Chambers told MPA. They're even offering referral fees of 0.4 to 0.5% on these referral channels. Chambers said the issue had been brought to his attention by multiple real estate agents referrers who claimed that they're being contacted by lending representatives from the bank in question, offering them 0.44% of the loan amount as a commission. According to Chambers, there are even real estate franchise groups looking to partner up with the bank and integrate its technology into their CRMs. This arrangement doesn't make sense commercially when you consider the costs of a lending representative's salary and bonuses, in addition to the cost of paying a referrer a commission, he said. To fund loans via their own lending staff, wages and bonuses are also paying a 0.4 to 0.5% referral fee on top that can't be less than just paying brokers 0.65% up front and a 0.15% trail, he said. There is also a training and management cost. For Chambers, this arrangement is reason enough to make him believe that the bank is undeniably going head-to-head with broker distribution and trying to take back market share. But the consumer is the one who will decide who they prefer to deal with, and personally, he said, I believe choice and professionalism will lead the consumers back to the broker channel. Consumers clearly prefer choice, with speaking to a lending expert who offers countless products and policies of various lenders, not a bank representative who only offers one. The consistent growth in market share of broker-distributed loans, rising over the past decade from 15 to 20% to 60%, clearly shows what consumers prefer. Now to politics. Mark Kenny, professor of the Australian Studies Institute at the ANU, wrote in The Conversation, as Australia's vaccination bungle becomes clear, Morrison's political pain is only just beginning. Among many surprising things about 2020 was how a novel coronavirus drove an equally novel upending of Australia's political orthodoxy. The hackneyed election straightener, "It's the economy, stupid," got shoved aside for a refreshing new imperative is the community stupid. Australians unhesitatingly turned to government, embracing expertise and willingly abided by society-wide deprivations in the interests of the whole. Reluctantly at first, centre-right politicians fell into line. Those who had built their careers on the virtues of small government and gruff fiscal discipline flipped to become big spending hyper-Keynesians. Necessarily, political combat took a back seat to problem solving. In an atmosphere of policy, not politics, voters backed incumbent governments, marking them favourably for doing their jobs. Every election since the crisis began has returned the incumbents in the Northern Territory, ACT, Queensland and Western Australia. In the latter case, Labor's Mark McGowan, arguably the country's most aggressively parochial premier, was endorsed so strongly in March that the Liberal opposition officially ceased to exist. Federally, Prime Minister Scott Morrison reaped the dividends of Australia's tandem run of good management and good luck. While our closest allies, the United States and the United Kingdom, descended into death and division, Australia closed its international borders early. It then compartmentalised further, with the states episodically insulating their own populations and their own hospital systems. Of course there were mistakes, but the aggregate impact of those measures, high public trust and the deliberately consensual mechanism of Morrison's National Cabinet has served the country well. But then in 2021 there's been a whole new ballgame, and one for which a Prime Minister not accustomed to pressure has proved to be far less well equipped. The vaccine rollout, which, remember, started stubbornly late, is in disarray. A promised 4 million inoculations by the end of March and completion by the end of October proved wildly unrealistic. And as of Sunday, the government says it hopes all Australians could receive at least one dose of vaccine by the end of the year. But as Morrison posted on Facebook, the government has no plans for any new targets because it is not possible to set such targets given the many uncertainties involved. Through the second half of last year, as it became clear that there would be an effective vaccine, Morrison's Health Minister Greg Hunt and health authorities assured worried Australians the government was up to the global competition, and that Canberra was being sufficiently front-footed about procuring vaccines. As Morrison boasted in a press statement on August the 19th, Australians will be among the first in the world to receive a COVID-19 vaccine if it proves successful through an agreement between the Australian government and UK-based company AstraZeneca. In November, he also said, "Our strategy puts Australia at the head of the queue." This was always unconvincing. That claimed agreement turned out to have been an over-egged letter of intent. Even ordinary observers could see demand from wealthy countries would be strong and binding contracts would need to be signed quickly if Australia was to secure early adequate supplies. It is now clear Australia's risk-averse pandemic management, much of which was driven by premiers having been followed by an insufficiently risk-aware vaccine contingency controlled by the Commonwealth. And so we see another bizarre inversion, Australia being trounced by Britain and America, countries that have persistently botched their infection response. Post-Trump America is now vaccinating 3 million people a day and has gone above 4 million at least once. COVID-ravaged Britain is also roaring ahead. More than half of adults have had their first jab. But what is not clear is why Morrison et al. Insisted the absence of urgency was an advantage, because combined with our judicious portfolio approach to multiple acquisitions, our health authorities could plan and execute a textbook public vaccination program. Trouble is, the states have complained about a lack of genuine cooperation in the rollout, critical supply problems have been obscured, and the much vaunted broad portfolio approach has had its narrowness exposed. Clearly, the slow and steady approach failed to build in redundancy for the whole in manageable interruptions to supply from international competition and technical limitations in production and transporting. Then there is the straight-out vaccine nationalism, which has been the cause of a blocked shipment from Italy. Australia's approach rather relied initially on two locally producible vaccines, primarily the Pfizer, later Novavax, as a backup. The University of Queensland one which fell over in December, and AstraZeneca, which is now not preferred for those under 50. While the AstraZeneca clotting risk is hardly a public health disaster, it has been compared to that of long-haul flights. It is certainly a disaster for an already fractious vaccine confidence. Morrison now faces multiple serious threats. Coupled with a poorly managed political crisis over the treatment of women, Morrison's 2021 has been tin-eared. A sharp decline in public trust in government, in expertise and in institutional competence looms as a clear and present danger for Morrison's popularity. Business-as-usual politics is already making a comeback, with Labour's Mark Butler toughening up of criticism of the rollout and calling for more transparency and a greater sense of urgency. Labour has little choice. Voters themselves see other countries are surging ahead while Australia inches along, tempting the fate of another outbreak and delaying the economic recovery dependent on vaccination. And that's the next inversion we're likely to see. Business and coalition hardliners were outspoken last year against state border closures, lockdowns and other restrictions on economic grounds. Expect to hear those voices too in coming weeks as the penny drops about a whole extra year lost to the pandemic. And finally, as the ABC reported, and clearly in intentional timing, Australia Post has appointed a new chief executive to replace Christine Holgate, who was controversially ousted late last year after awarding 4 senior executives Cartier watches worth around $20,000. Woolworths Chief Supply Officer Paul Graham will join Australia Post in September after more than decades of logistics experience, including recent senior executive roles at global parcel transport giant DHL. And of course, the timing is interesting ahead of the Senate inquiry tomorrow, where all of these issues are going to be hauled over. I, for one, think that this timing was deliberate, intentional, and underscores once again how politics goes in completely different directions to the real life experience of many ordinary people. And just a quick reminder that tomorrow, Tuesday, I'll be joined by Chris Bates, mortgage broker, and we'll be talking about the Sydney property market, so I look forward to seeing you then. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.